In September 1939, Europe once again descended into war. For Britain, it was a moment of grim resolve. The memory of the Great War was still raw, yet here the nation stood, faced with a new threat from Nazi Germany. When Germany invaded Poland, Britain and France declared war, but it quickly became clear that Britain would soon be left to shoulder the burden alone. France collapsed in 1940, and the evacuation from Dunkirk was both a miracle and a humiliation. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were rescued, but they returned without their weapons, leaving Britain vulnerable and exposed. In those dark months, the island nation stood defiant. Churchill had just taken office as Prime Minister, and his speeches became the lifeblood of morale. "We shall fight on the beaches," he declared, and though the words could not stop bombs, they steeled the nation for what lay ahead. Britain faced the very real possibility of invasion. Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's plan to cross the Channel, loomed over every household, every coastal village, every soldier standing guard on the cliffs of Dover. The British people were not only preparing for war at sea and in the skies, they were bracing for war in their very streets. Barricades were erected, barbed wire rolled out across beaches, and the Home Guard, composed of older men and volunteers, stood ready with little more than hunting rifles and determination. Children were evacuated from London and other major cities, sent to the countryside to escape the anticipated onslaught. Mothers wept as they placed their children on trains, unsure if they would ever see them again. Meanwhile, Germany tightened its grip on the continent. Nations fell one by one, and by mid-1940, Hitler's armies controlled vast swaths of Europe. Britain was alone, staring across the Channel at an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Supplies were running low. The U-boat campaign strangled shipping lanes, threatening to starve the nation. Every convoy that arrived from Canada or the United States carried not just food and weapons, but hope itself. The people of Britain learned to live with rationing, limited meat, sugar, butter, even clothing. They planted victory gardens in backyards and parks. They mended and reused everything they could. Sacrifice became a way of life. At the same time, the Royal Air Force prepared for what would become one of the most decisive battles of the war. Pilots, many of them barely out of their teens, took to the skies in Spitfires and Hurricanes, facing the Luftwaffe's relentless bombing raids. In the summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain began. It was not just a fight for air superiority, it was a fight for survival. Day after day, the skies over southern England roared with combat. The losses were heavy, but the RAF held firm. In Churchill's words, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." As bombs fell on London, Coventry, and countless towns and villages, ordinary citizens endured nights in air raid shelters, waking to streets reduced to rubble. Firefighters and rescue workers braved the flames, pulling survivors from collapsed buildings. In the face of destruction, the spirit of endurance hardened. Britain had not broken. Instead, it had proven that it could stand alone, if only long enough for help to come. This was the crucible of Britain's endurance, the moment when the nation's fate hung by a thread. Isolated, threatened, rationed, and bombed, Britain nevertheless held the line. That endurance would shape the course of the war and set the stage for the emergence of a new partner across the Atlantic, one whose power was only beginning to awaken. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood battered but unbroken. The threat of invasion still loomed large, yet Hitler's ambitions shifted toward the skies. If Germany could not cross the Channel with ships and troops, it would first have to dominate the air. Thus began a new phase of the struggle, one that would test not only Britain's military capacity but also the very resilience of its people. The Battle of Britain was unlike anything the world had seen before, a clash fought above towns and fields, where the fate of a nation hung on the skill of young pilots and the resolve of ordinary citizens below. Day after day, the German Luftwaffe sent waves of bombers and fighters across the Channel. Their targets ranged from airfields and radar stations to factories and cities. In sleek Spitfires and rugged Hurricanes, the Royal Air Force scrambled to meet them. The battles were swift, brutal, and often over in minutes. Many of the pilots were barely out of their teens, their training rushed, their survival far from guaranteed. To fly meant to face death on every sortie. For those who returned, there was often no time to rest. Planes needed repairing, ammunition reloaded, and then the call came again. The German high command believed that Britain would crumble under pressure. After all, France had fallen in mere weeks. Yet Britain proved different. Radar, a new and revolutionary technology, gave the RAF a crucial edge. It allowed commanders to track incoming raids and direct fighters with precision. Combined with the courage of the pilots, it turned the skies into a deadly trap for the invaders. Churchill, ever the voice of defiance, watched events unfold with grim determination. His famous remark, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," captured the spirit of those days. The few were the fighter pilots, but their struggle was shared by countless others. The ground crews who patched up damaged aircraft through sleepless nights, the anti-aircraft gunners who stood ready at every corner of the coast, and the civilians who endured the thunder of bombs above their homes. By September, the Luftwaffe shifted tactics. Instead of focusing on military targets, they began a campaign of terror against cities. London became the chief target. Night after night, the capital burned. Families huddled in underground stations as the Blitz roared above them. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble in hours. Children carried gas masks to school, unsure if they would return home. In Coventry, one of Britain's great industrial cities, bombs fell with such ferocity that its cathedral lay in ruins by morning. Yet even amid destruction, life continued. Buses still ran, shops reopened, and workers went back to their factories. Endurance became second nature. The Germans had hoped that terror would break morale, but the opposite occurred. The more the bombs fell, the more determined the British people became. Communities came together in shelters, sharing food, singing songs, and finding comfort in solidarity. Newspapers reported stories of survival and courage, while radio broadcasts carried Churchill's unshakable voice into homes across the nation. The message was clear: Britain would not bow. For Germany, the Battle of Britain marked a bitter defeat. The Luftwaffe lost thousands of aircraft and pilots, while Britain's fighter command remained intact. Operation Sea Lion, the plan to invade, was postponed indefinitely. Britain had survived the onslaught. Though the bombing would continue through 1941, the immediate threat of invasion was gone. The endurance of the RAF was celebrated, but it was not the only measure of Britain's survival. The ordinary people, the shopkeepers, teachers, dockworkers, and mothers, had shown a resilience that astonished the world. Britain had stood alone against the might of Nazi Germany and had not only survived but also inflicted the enemy's first major defeat. This victory carried immense symbolic weight. Across the Atlantic, Americans watched with admiration. Though still officially neutral, many in the United States saw in Britain's struggle a fight for the very values of democracy and freedom. The endurance of this small island, battered but unyielding, stirred American sympathy and laid the foundation for a partnership that would soon change the world. Britain, however, knew the struggle was far from over. The Blitz had scarred its cities, strained its economy, and exhausted its people. Yet in standing firm, Britain had bought time. Time for industry to rebuild, for allies to awaken, and for the tide of war to begin to shift. The endurance of 1940 and 1941 was not just survival. It was the planting of seeds for eventual victory. As the bombs rained down through the long months of the Blitz, life in Britain took on a rhythm of endurance. Every night the air raid sirens wailed, and people rushed to shelters, clutching whatever belongings they could carry. Families crammed into underground stations, listening as the distant hum of aircraft grew into the terrifying roar of explosions. Sleep was rare, fear constant, yet somehow the people adapted. In the morning, they emerged into streets littered with rubble and broken glass, only to sweep them clean and carry on with their day. It was a strange form of defiance, a way of showing the enemy that life would go on no matter the destruction. London was the primary target, but it was not alone. Industrial centers like Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, and Sheffield felt the fury of German bombs. These cities, vital to Britain's war production, were battered relentlessly. Factories were destroyed, homes shattered, and yet production never stopped. Workers labored in damaged plants, often in freezing conditions, repairing machines with scraps and salvaged parts. Women, who had already stepped into roles left vacant by men at war, became the backbone of this effort. They worked in munitions factories, drove ambulances, and staffed fire brigades. Their contributions were not glamorous, but they were essential, keeping the machinery of survival in motion. Rationing, introduced in 1940, grew harsher with each passing year. Every meal was a calculation: how to stretch limited meat, sugar, and fats to feed a family. People grew accustomed to powdered eggs, spam, and strange substitutes for butter and milk. Clothing, too, was rationed. Old coats were patched, dresses cut down for children, and wool unraveled to be knitted anew. The government urged citizens to make do and mend, and the slogan became a philosophy of endurance. In gardens and public parks, vegetables were planted in what came to be known as victory gardens. Even the smallest plot of land was turned into a weapon of survival. Children lived a life both ordinary and extraordinary. Schools continued, though often interrupted by raids. Gas masks were carried everywhere, a constant reminder of unseen dangers. Many children had been evacuated to the countryside, where they lived with strangers far from their families. Some found kindness and stability, others endured loneliness or neglect. For those who remained in the cities, nights spent in shelters became routine. They learned to distinguish the sounds of different bombs, to know when it was safe to come out, and to find play even in the rubble of destroyed streets. Childhood in wartime Britain was marked by resilience born too early. Despite the hardships, morale did not collapse. Part of this was due to government propaganda, carefully designed to foster unity. Posters proclaimed slogans such as "Keep calm and carry on" and "Careless talk costs lives." The BBC played a crucial role as well, broadcasting news, music, and entertainment that connected the nation. Churchill's speeches, carried by radio into homes across Britain, provided a sense of steadfast leadership. His defiance became the people's defiance. His words reassured them that they were not merely victims of war, but active participants in a struggle that had meaning. The Blitz also created moments of remarkable courage. Firefighters braved infernos to save entire blocks from destruction. Rescue workers dug through debris with bare hands to pull survivors from the ruins. Doctors and nurses worked without rest in overcrowded hospitals, treating endless streams of the injured. Ordinary citizens too became heroes, neighbors who risked their lives to save others, or volunteers who guided families through the smoke-filled streets to safety. Every act of bravery, no matter how small, was part of the greater endurance that defined Britain in those years. Even as the bombs fell, people sought moments of normality. Theaters reopened whenever possible, offering brief escapes into music and drama. Pubs filled with laughter and song, even as blackout curtains hid their light from enemy bombers. Weddings were held quickly, before grooms left for the front. Babies were born in shelters, their first cries mingling with the echoes of distant explosions. Life, though fragile, refused to be extinguished. The destruction left deep scars, both physical and emotional. Streets were permanently altered, landmarks erased. Families mourned losses that could never be replaced. Yet in a strange way, the shared suffering strengthened bonds within communities. Neighbors supported one another, sharing food, clothing, and comfort. The sense of collective struggle became a shield against despair. Internationally, Britain's endurance under the Blitz captured the world's attention. American newspapers carried photographs of Londoners standing amidst ruins, smiling defiantly at the camera. The image of a small island refusing to bow to tyranny stirred admiration across the Atlantic. While America was still officially neutral, public sympathy for Britain grew stronger with each passing month. Slowly, the groundwork was being laid for a partnership that would one day tip the balance of the war. For now, though, Britain remained alone. The bombs did not cease, and the hardships did not lessen. But through fire and rubble, rationing and fear, the people of Britain endured. It was not merely survival, it was a statement. They would not be broken. And in that endurance lay the foundation for what was yet to come, for allies not yet arrived, and for a victory still far in the distance. Across the Atlantic, life during the same years looked profoundly different. While Britain struggled under the constant threat of bombings and shortages, the United States was living in a reality that, at first, seemed untouched by the war. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles buzzed with life, their skylines lit up at night without fear of enemy aircraft. Movie theaters were packed, jazz music poured from radios, and baseball games still drew crowds. For Americans, in those early years before their official entry into the war, life continued with a sense of distance from the devastation engulfing Europe. Yet beneath that normality, the war was already reshaping the nation. Even before Pearl Harbor, American industry had begun to awaken. Factories that once produced automobiles or household appliances shifted their gears to produce tanks, planes, and ships. The phrase, "arsenal of democracy," became reality as the sheer scale of U.S. production dwarfed that of any other nation. For many workers, especially women and minorities, this created opportunities previously denied. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of women stepping into roles once considered exclusively male. They worked long shifts in shipyards and munitions plants, their hair tied back with scarves, their hands calloused from hard labor, but their pride evident in every completed task. The economic transformation was staggering. Unemployment, still lingering from the Great Depression, nearly vanished as millions found work in wartime industries. Entire towns sprang up around new factories, filled with families who had traveled across the country in search of steady wages. The government poured billions into construction, new highways, new ports, and vast assembly lines that seemed almost endless. American workers were told they were building not just machines, but freedom itself, and many believed it deeply. Daily life for American families was marked by contrasts. On one hand, there was prosperity, with more money in circulation and more jobs than ever before. On the other hand, rationing eventually reached U.S. households as well, though it was never as severe as in Britain. Gasoline, rubber, and certain foods were restricted, but grocery shelves were rarely empty. Victory gardens appeared in American backyards too, though they were less a necessity and more a patriotic gesture. Even with restrictions, American children grew up with far more abundance than their British counterparts, enjoying milk, meat, and treats that were luxuries across the ocean. Entertainment flourished. Hollywood entered what is often called its golden age, producing films that both entertained and inspired. Patriotic war movies filled theaters, while stars like Humphrey Bogart, Katharine Hepburn, and Clark Gable became cultural icons. Radio remained central, broadcasting both music and news, but also government messages encouraging bond purchases and war support. Swing music filled dance halls, and couples jitterbugged the nights away even as brothers and fathers shipped off to war. For soldiers in training, America offered vast open spaces and modern facilities. Bases were constructed at a dizzying pace across the country, from deserts in California to fields in Georgia. Young men who had never left their hometowns suddenly found themselves living in barracks, drilling under the hot sun, and preparing for battlefields thousands of miles away. The military experience was grueling, but it also created a sense of unity among recruits from every corner of the nation. The war also highlighted divisions. African Americans, despite serving bravely, faced segregation in the military and discrimination at home. Yet they too contributed mightily to the war effort, from the Tuskegee Airmen flying combat missions to workers filling industrial jobs in northern cities. For many, the war became a turning point, planting seeds for the civil rights struggles that would follow. Japanese Americans, meanwhile, faced one of the darkest chapters in U.S. history. After Pearl Harbor, thousands were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in internment camps, their loyalty questioned simply because of their ancestry. While the broader population enjoyed prosperity, these families endured hardship and injustice that would take decades to be fully acknowledged. In the countryside, American farmers experienced booming demand. Their crops fed not only the United States but also allies overseas. New machinery and government programs increased efficiency, and while many young men left the farms for the army, women and older generations kept the fields productive. Agricultural fairs and local gatherings still occurred, offering small but cherished moments of community. What stood out most in comparison to Britain was the absence of direct destruction. American families did not cower in shelters during air raids, nor did they sift through the rubble of their homes after a bombing. Cities stood intact, lights shining brightly at night, streets bustling with commerce. This security shaped American attitudes toward the war. It was seen more as a distant responsibility than a daily terror. Yet after Pearl Harbor, that responsibility turned into urgency. Suddenly, the war was no longer across the ocean, it had arrived on American soil. The attack galvanized the population. Lines stretched outside recruitment offices as young men volunteered to serve. War bonds were bought eagerly, children collected scrap metal for recycling, and posters urging unity appeared in every town. Patriotic fervor surged, and within months, America was mobilized on a scale unprecedented in history. Still, even with this mobilization, daily life retained a sense of comfort compared to Europe. Families gathered for Sunday dinners, schools continued without interruption, and holidays were celebrated with familiar traditions. The contrast between the endurance of Britain under nightly raids and the relative safety of American homes could not have been starker. It was this combination, prosperity at home, industrial might, and geographic security, that positioned the United States to emerge as a global superpower. While Britain endured, America prepared, building strength that would eventually turn the tide of war. And though their experiences were vastly different, the bond between the two nations was beginning to solidify. The endurance of one and the resources of the other would soon merge into a partnership unlike any the world had ever seen. By 1942, the war had entered a new phase. Britain, battered but unbroken, was still holding the line against Nazi Germany, while the United States, shaken by Pearl Harbor, had thrown itself into full mobilization. The two nations, though separated by the Atlantic, were beginning to feel their destinies tied together. Their people lived such different daily realities, yet their struggles were converging into a shared cause. In Britain, the hardships of war only deepened as the years stretched on. The rationing system grew stricter, with meat, dairy, and even basic items like soap and clothing becoming harder to find. Families saved and reused everything from paper to string because nothing could be wasted. Blackout curtains still covered windows each night, even after the worst of the Blitz had passed, because no one knew when the enemy might return. Every family carried grief. Nearly everyone knew someone who had been killed, whether in the armed forces, under the rubble of bombings, or at sea from German submarines. And yet, despite the exhaustion, there was a stubborn determination. Communities looked out for one another. Women's voluntary services organized soup kitchens, sewing circles for uniforms, and assistance for bombed-out families. Children collected scrap paper and tin cans, proudly contributing to the war effort in small but meaningful ways. Life was hard, but there was a sense of shared burden, of being in it together, no matter how much it cost. In the United States, meanwhile, life was still touched by a strange duality. On one hand, there was the shadow of war, families saying goodbye to sons, brothers, and fathers heading overseas. On the other, there was still prosperity, with wages rising and industries booming. A sense of optimism ran through American society, fueled by the knowledge that the nation was secure and its resources abundant. Yet even with this optimism, sacrifice was demanded. Gasoline rationing limited travel, tires became scarce, and nylon stockings disappeared as factories turned to producing parachutes instead. Americans adapted, but always with the reassurance that their sacrifices were small compared to the suffering of allies abroad. The contrast between the two nations could be felt most sharply in the experience of children. In Britain, children played among ruins, their imaginations shaped by war. They carried gas masks to school, practiced air raid drills, and grew up far faster than they should have. For them, war was not distant. It was the sound of sirens at night and the sight of empty chairs at the family table. In America, children also felt the war, but differently. They collected scrap, bought war stamps, and followed the newsreels at movie theaters, but their homes were intact, their nights peaceful. They could dream of futures not overshadowed by destruction. Cultural life mirrored this divide. In Britain, the theater and cinema still operated, but often under strained conditions, with power outages and restrictions limiting what was possible. Films offered escape, but the reality outside the cinema doors was never far away. Music halls, with their sing-along spirit, kept morale alive, reminding people that laughter and joy were still possible even in the darkest times. In America, Hollywood thrived. Stars appeared on screen in patriotic epics, glamorous musicals, and romantic dramas, offering comfort and escape. Radio shows captivated millions, mixing entertainment with subtle propaganda designed to keep spirits high. Despite the different realities, both nations were united by one thing: the human longing for normalcy. Weddings were celebrated, babies were born, birthdays came and went. In Britain, a bride might wear a gown made from repurposed fabric, while in America, families might send parcels of food and supplies to relatives overseas. Everyday life bent under the weight of war, but it never completely broke. The partnership between Britain and the United States began to grow stronger, not just through governments and generals but through the awareness of ordinary people. American soldiers stationed in Britain brought with them glimpses of another world: gum, cigarettes, jazz records, and slang that seemed exotic to British ears. For some, these encounters were thrilling. For others, they highlighted the gap between the struggles of Britain and the relative abundance of America. But slowly, bonds of friendship formed. Shared dances, shared meals, and shared fears on the eve of battle began to bridge the cultural divide. For Britain, American support became lifeline after lifeline. Lend-Lease shipments brought food, weapons, and raw materials across the dangerous Atlantic routes, where German U-boats lurked. Every crate unloaded in a British port was a reminder that they were not as alone as they once had been. For Americans, these shipments were not only about helping an ally, they were also about preparing for a war they now knew they could not avoid. The endurance of Britain and the rising power of America created a contrast that fascinated the world. One nation survived on sheer resilience, enduring destruction with grim determination. The other built strength at a staggering pace, its untouched cities and massive factories pointing toward the future. Yet neither could win alone. Britain needed America's resources, and America needed Britain's experience and strategic foothold in Europe. The war was forging a bond that was as much about survival as it was about shared ideals. By the middle of the war, people on both sides of the Atlantic began to sense that history was turning. Victory was not yet in sight, but hope was no longer a distant dream. Britain had endured the storm, America had entered the fight, and together they were beginning to build the momentum that would one day break the Axis powers. The daily struggles of ordinary citizens, rationing, working, waiting, worrying, were the unseen threads weaving that larger story. Each act of endurance in Britain, each act of production in America, contributed to the same outcome: a future where freedom might once again prevail. And so, as the war dragged on, the lives of people in Britain and America remained profoundly different, yet inseparably linked. Across bombed-out streets and bustling assembly lines, across blacked-out London and brightly lit New York, across fear and abundance, the two nations were writing a shared chapter of history, one born from endurance, sacrifice, and the quiet determination of millions. By 1943, the war had reached a grinding, global scale, and the differences between life in Britain and the United States became even clearer. Britain was deep into its fourth year of war, and the weight of exhaustion pressed heavily on its people. Streets bore the scars of bombing raids, rationing had become second nature, and the war seemed endless. In America, by contrast, the war years had transformed society but without stripping away its sense of security. The two nations were on the same side, yet their people lived through entirely different versions of the same conflict. In Britain, the resilience that had carried the nation through the Blitz was tested daily. Food rations grew smaller, and queues outside shops became longer. Housewives carried ration books everywhere, carefully planning meals with what little was available. Sugar, tea, and meat were prized commodities, and substitutions became the norm. Children received powdered milk, while adults went without. People joked darkly about Woolton pie, a dish of vegetables and flour promoted by the government, but beneath the humor was a quiet hunger. Clothes, too, were rationed, and people patched garments until they were almost unrecognizable. To own a new pair of shoes was a rarity, and even soap and fuel were carefully measured out. Despite these shortages, morale did not collapse. Communities found ways to make the best of what they had. Local dances were held, often with homemade decorations and bands playing whatever instruments could be gathered. Families shared food when they could, neighbors looked after children, and even in the face of grief, there was solidarity. Religion offered comfort, with churches holding regular services reminding people of faith and endurance. Yet, in quieter moments, many Britons wondered how much longer they could hold out. For Americans, rationing was introduced too, but it felt different. Families received ration books for gasoline, tires, sugar, and certain meats, yet supermarkets remained far better stocked than anything seen in Britain. The abundance of farmland and resources meant that Americans still ate relatively well. A family dinner might feature fewer luxuries, but it rarely left anyone hungry. Victory gardens appeared in suburban yards and city lots, not because survival depended on them, but because it was seen as patriotic. Even with restrictions, American children drank milk, ate butter, and enjoyed treats that British children could only dream about. The American home front was marked not by deprivation but by constant activity. Millions of men were overseas, but at home, factories roared to life 24 hours a day. The country's vast industrial might was unleashed, producing airplanes, tanks, ships, and weapons at a staggering pace. Cities like Detroit became known as the arsenal of democracy, where assembly lines produced bombers and jeeps instead of cars. Shipyards in California and along the East Coast launched vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them. Everywhere, posters urged workers to give more, to waste nothing, and to remember that each hour of labor brought the war closer to victory. Women were at the heart of this transformation. Millions joined the workforce, taking on roles once reserved for men. They riveted planes, welded steel, and worked long shifts in noisy factories. Rosie the Riveter became a cultural icon, representing both empowerment and sacrifice. For many women, this was the first taste of independence, and it would reshape American society long after the war ended. African Americans and other minorities also contributed, though often in the face of discrimination. The WWII campaign, Victory Abroad Against Fascism and Victory at Home Against Segregation, captured the spirit of a community fighting for equality as well as survival. Britain also saw women step into critical roles, though the context was different. With so many men away fighting, women took over farms, driving tractors and managing crops in the Women's Land Army. Others joined civil defense, manning fire stations, driving ambulances, and digging survivors from bombed-out rubble. Many worked in munitions factories, producing shells and bombs under dangerous conditions. Their work kept the country alive, but the strain was immense. Unlike in America, where prosperity cushioned the hardships, in Britain the effort felt like survival itself. The atmosphere in American cities remained vibrant despite the war. Nightclubs echoed with swing music, soldiers on leave danced with local girls, and movie theaters showed newsreels alongside glamorous Hollywood films. Stars like Bing Crosby and Judy Garland entertained troops and civilians alike, offering songs that boosted morale. In Britain, cultural life continued too, but under darker skies. Music halls provided laughter, theaters staged plays, and the BBC broadcast music and news, but the weight of bombings and shortages was always present. Where Americans jitterbugged in brightly lit dance halls, Britons sang together in underground shelters to drown out the noise of bombs overhead. The human cost of war, however, touched both nations deeply. In Britain, casualty lists were published regularly, and nearly every family had lost someone or knew someone serving overseas. In America, telegrams arrived at households with news that sons or husbands had been killed in distant battles. Communities held funerals, raised flags in memory, and carried grief even amid prosperity. For both nations, war was never abstract. It was written in the empty chairs at dinner tables and the letters that arrived from far away. The partnership between Britain and America was now undeniable. American soldiers flooded into Britain, preparing for the great invasion that would eventually liberate Europe. For British civilians, the arrival of these troops brought mixed feelings. On one hand, they were welcomed as allies, symbols of hope, and often sources of small luxuries like chewing gum, cigarettes, and chocolate. On the other hand, the abundance of the Americans was a stark reminder of British deprivation. Some joked about the Americans being overpaid, oversexed, and overhere, but beneath the humor was recognition that these men were vital to the coming fight. For the Americans stationed in Britain, the contrast was striking. They marveled at the resilience of their hosts, at families who carried on despite bombed-out homes and empty cupboards. At the same time, they struggled to adjust to the shortages, the blackouts, and the quiet endurance that had become second nature to Britons. These encounters, sometimes awkward, sometimes heartwarming, built bridges of understanding between two peoples who needed each other more than ever. By the time 1943 drew to a close, the balance of the war was beginning to shift. Britain had endured the worst, America had fully mobilized, and together they were preparing for the decisive battles to come. The daily lives of their citizens remained worlds apart, one marked by survival and scarcity, the other by production and relative comfort, but the threads were drawing tighter. The endurance of Britain and the abundance of America were no longer separate stories. They were merging into a single narrative, one that would shape not just the outcome of the war, but the future of the modern world. By 1944, the war was reaching its most decisive stage. The people of Britain had endured nearly 5 years of hardship, while in America the war machine had reached a level of output the world had never seen before. Across the Atlantic, two very different home fronts were moving in the same direction, toward an invasion that would define the fate of Europe. For Britain, the long years of endurance had left deep marks. Cities were scarred, streets lined with ruins that reminded people daily of the Blitz and the bombings that followed. Families were fractured, with loved ones missing or serving far from home. Food rationing was still severe. People queued for hours for small portions of butter, sugar, or tea. Children had grown up in the shadow of war, their earliest memories shaped by sirens, shelters, and the sight of destruction. Yet, despite the exhaustion, there was anticipation. Everyone knew something was coming. Allied troops filled the countryside, training for the invasion of France, and British civilians sensed that the turning point was near. Daily life in Britain by this stage was a balance between grim necessity and cautious hope. Blackout curtains were still drawn every night, ration books still controlled every meal, and long work hours drained the energy of millions. But there was also a feeling that their endurance had not been in vain. The tide was turning. German bombings had lessened, though the new threat of V-1 flying bombs brought terror once again, their distinctive buzzing sounds striking fear into hearts. Still, people carried on. Shelters were filled again when the flying bombs arrived, but with each passing week, the sense grew stronger that the end might finally be within reach. In the United States, meanwhile, the war effort reached its peak. Factories across the nation operated around the clock, producing planes, tanks, ships, and weapons at a pace that stunned the world. Detroit alone built thousands of bombers and jeeps, while shipyards launched vessels so quickly that German U-boats could no longer keep up. The American economy, once crippled by depression, now roared with energy and purpose. Jobs were plentiful, wages were higher, and for many families, the war years brought prosperity. Yet this prosperity was tempered by sacrifice. Gasoline rationing limited travel, families collected scrap for recycling, and nearly every household had someone serving overseas. For American families, letters from soldiers became lifelines. Mothers and fathers read them aloud at kitchen tables, sometimes laughing at their sons' jokes, sometimes weeping over the dangers described. Children kept photos of their fathers in uniform by their bedsides, proudly telling friends at school that Daddy is fighting the war. Communities supported one another through church services, bond drives, and rallies. Though far from the battlefields, Americans felt connected to the struggle, their lives shaped by the knowledge that their efforts at home were fueling victory abroad. Cultural life on both sides of the Atlantic reflected these realities. In Britain, music halls, plays, and radio shows provided moments of escape from the bleakness of daily life. Songs of hope and love were sung in shelters and on the BBC, reminding listeners of the humanity that war could not destroy. In America, Hollywood poured out patriotic films, glamorous musicals, and stirring war dramas. Stars traveled to entertain troops overseas, while at home, swing music kept spirits high. Life in America still carried a sense of normalcy, bright lights, crowded theaters, bustling streets, so different from the blacked-out, battered cities of Britain. The interaction between the two nations became even more intense as American soldiers filled Britain in preparation for D-Day. The countryside was crowded with training camps, airfields, and supply depots. For British civilians, the presence of so many Americans was both a novelty and a strain. On the one hand, they brought abundance, chewing gum, chocolate, cigarettes, nylons, luxuries that seemed almost magical to ration-weary Britons. On the other, the contrast between British deprivation and American plenty was sometimes painful. Some British families resented the wealth of the GIs, while others embraced their generosity and companionship. Friendships were formed, romances blossomed, and thousands of war brides would eventually cross the ocean after marrying American servicemen. For the Americans, life in Britain was an adjustment. The bomb-damaged cities, the strict rationing, and the quiet resilience of the British people made a deep impression. Many soldiers wrote home about the toughness of the civilians, admiring the way they carried on in the face of shortages and destruction. They experienced firsthand the realities of a war that, for their own families back home, was still far away. The presence of American troops also created small cultural clashes, from differences in slang and manners to competition for dances and dates, but overall, the bond between the two nations grew stronger through these daily interactions. The psychological differences were stark. In Britain, war was personal. It was the sound of an air raid siren, the taste of powdered eggs, the empty space where a home once stood. In America, war was industrial. It was the roar of factories, the posters urging sacrifice, the booming economy. One nation survived through endurance, the other through abundance. Yet together, they formed a partnership that was greater than either could have achieved alone. As the Allied invasion of France approached, this partnership became the central focus of life on both home fronts. In Britain, civilians lived among the buildup, columns of tanks rumbling through villages, skies filled with aircraft, harbors crowded with ships. In America, families worked longer hours, bought more bonds, and followed the news anxiously. When D-Day finally came in June 1944, it was the culmination of years of sacrifice on both sides. For Britain, it was the hope that the end was finally near. For America, it was the proof that its vast efforts had made a difference. The war was not yet over, but by 1944 the shape of victory was becoming clear. Britain's endurance had held the line through the darkest years, and America's power had built the momentum to push forward. Together, they had turned survival into strength. The daily lives of ordinary people, ration books in Britain, factory shifts in America, letters sent across oceans, were the unseen foundation of that victory. And though the hardships continued, both nations could finally believe that their sacrifices would lead to a future where peace might once again be possible. By 1945, the world stood at the edge of transformation. The long years of struggle were finally giving way to the promise of victory. For the people of Britain and the United States, the war had shaped daily life so differently, yet both nations now shared the same anticipation, the hope that soon, at last, it would be over. In Britain, the war had left scars that would take generations to heal. Cities were marked by ruins, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Families lived with ration books still tightly clutched in their hands, queuing patiently for whatever food was available. The shortages were harsher than ever. Bread, once untouched by rationing, was now limited. Potatoes and vegetables became staples, while luxuries like meat and sugar were nearly forgotten. Children born at the beginning of the war were now old enough to understand fully what had been taken from them. They had grown up without the abundance that others elsewhere enjoyed, their childhoods shaped by fear, hunger, and the endurance of their parents. Yet, in spite of the deprivation, there was pride. Britain had survived when survival seemed impossible. The endurance through the Blitz, the sacrifices of rationing, the unbreakable spirit of ordinary people, all had carried the nation through its darkest hours. Now, with Germany weakening and Allied troops advancing on every front, Civilians allowed themselves to dream of peace. Celebrations were not yet certain, but hope had returned in full. In America, the war years ended very differently. Cities had never been bombed, homes never destroyed. Instead, the war had left behind a booming economy, technological advancements, and a sense of global responsibility. For many American families, the war had been a time of prosperity. Jobs were plentiful, wages had risen, and industries had flourished. But even in this prosperity, grief was never far away. Millions of American families had lost loved ones in distant battles, their absence a reminder that victory came with a price. Daily life in the U.S. in 1945 still carried the marks of war. Rationing continued, though far less harshly than in Britain. Gasoline and rubber were still scarce, and families were urged to conserve. But grocery stores remained better stocked, theaters remained open, and children grew up in security that their British counterparts could scarcely imagine. Baseball games were played, Hollywood produced new films, and swing music filled the airwaves, even as news of battles in Europe and the Pacific dominated the headlines. The contrast between the two nations became clear in the way they anticipated the war's end. In Britain, it was with a desperate yearning, a hunger for peace, for full meals, for quiet nights without sirens. In America, it was with determination, knowing that the nation's role was not only to win but to lead the post-war world. Both nations, however, shared the grief of sacrifice. Britain had endured years of bombing and destruction, America had sent millions of young men to fight across two oceans, and both had paid a heavy cost in lives. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the celebrations revealed just how deeply the war had been felt. In Britain, crowds flooded the streets of London. People danced, sang, and embraced strangers, filling Trafalgar Square and Piccadilly Circus with joyous chaos. King George VI and Prime Minister Winston Churchill appeared on balconies, waving to the jubilant crowds. Yet even in the joy, there was exhaustion. The war in Europe was over, but rationing continued, cities were still in ruins, and rebuilding loomed as a monumental task. For many Britons, the victory was bittersweet, a triumph mixed with the memory of all that had been lost. In America, the celebrations were just as intense. Crowds filled Times Square, sailors kissed nurses in iconic moments captured by photographers, and small towns across the country held parades and parties. Unlike Britain, however, America's cities stood untouched, its economy stronger than ever. Victory meant not only the end of war but also the beginning of a new role as a global power. While Britain looked toward rebuilding, America looked toward shaping the future of the world order. Even as Germany surrendered, the war was not over. In the Pacific, the conflict raged on. American families followed the brutal island battles through newspapers and radio broadcasts, waiting anxiously for news. British families too kept watch, knowing that victory in Europe was not complete without victory in Asia. The dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 finally brought the war to an end, shocking the world with the destructive power of new technology. When peace finally came, both Britain and America faced the challenge of transition. In Britain, the years ahead would be difficult. Rationing continued well into the 1950s, and the damage to cities and industries would take years to repair. Yet there was also a sense of renewal. The war had united the nation, forged resilience, and laid the groundwork for sweeping social changes, including the creation of the welfare state. For ordinary Britons, peace meant not only relief but also the chance to rebuild a fairer society. In America, the post-war years began with optimism. Returning soldiers found jobs in booming industries, the GI Bill provided education and housing, and families began moving into new suburbs. The prosperity of the war years rolled into the prosperity of peacetime, cementing America's position as the world's leading power. Yet even in the glow of victory, there were challenges, racial tensions, questions of global responsibility, and the looming reality of the Cold War. The experiences of Britain and America during World War II had been profoundly different. One had endured destruction, hunger, and fear, surviving on sheer resilience. The other had thrived economically while sacrificing its young men on faraway battlefields, emerging stronger than before. Yet together, These two nations had formed a partnership that defined the war and shaped the peace. For the people who lived through those years, the memories never faded. The sound of air raid sirens, the smell of factory floors, the taste of rationed meals, the letters from soldiers, all became part of their lives. Their sacrifices, endurance, and courage carried the weight of history, leaving behind not only the victory of 1945 but also the foundation of the modern world. In the end, the story of World War II was not only about battles fought or leaders who commanded. It was about the daily lives of ordinary people, Britons who endured in darkness, Americans who built in abundance, and both who carried the hope of freedom through the storm. Their lives were different, their struggles unequal, but their destinies intertwined. Together, they endured, they fought, and they emerged into a world forever changed.